The morning sun painted golden streaks across the ancient stones of Westminster Abbey as crowds began gathering along the historic streets of London. Something special was about to happen, and word had spread quickly through social media and news channels. Prince William and Catherine, Princess of Wales, were scheduled to attend a community event that would bring together children from diverse backgrounds across the United Kingdom. Sarah Mitchell stood among the waiting crowd, her phone ready to capture whatever moments would unfold. She had traveled from Manchester with her two daughters, specifically for this occasion. Like millions of others, she felt drawn to the warmth and genuine connection that William and Kate consistently showed during their public appearances. There was something different about today's event, though. The palace had announced it would focus on mental health awareness for young people, a cause both royals had championed for years. Inside the Abbey, volunteers worked tirelessly to prepare the space. Tables were arranged in circles rather than traditional rows, creating an intimate atmosphere where real conversations could happen. Colorful artwork created by children from various charity organizations decorated the walls. Each piece told a story of struggle, hope, and resilience. The organizers wanted this gathering to feel less like a formal royal engagement and more like a family meeting where everyone's voice mattered. 12-year-old Marcus Johnson fidgeted nervously in his seat. He represented a youth mental health program from Birmingham that had helped him through difficult times after losing his father. Marcus had been chosen to speak directly with the royal couple about his experiences. His hands trembled slightly as he clutched the notes his counselor had helped him prepare. He never imagined he would be in such a place, about to share his personal story with people he had only seen on television and in newspapers. The Abbey's ancient doors opened, and a hush fell over the assembled crowd outside. William and Kate emerged from their vehicle, and immediately something felt different from typical royal walkabouts. Instead of the usual brief handshakes and quick exchanges, they stopped genuinely to connect with people. Kate knelt down to speak with a little girl holding a homemade sign that read, "Thank you for caring about us." The princess spent several minutes chatting with the child, admiring her drawing and asking about her family. William moved through the crowd with equal warmth, stopping to joke with teenagers who nervously asked for selfies. He seemed completely at ease, laughing genuinely at their comments and asking thoughtful questions about their lives. Security personnel maintained a respectful distance, allowing these organic moments to unfold naturally. Photographers captured images that would soon travel around the world. But the real magic was happening in these brief, authentic exchanges once inside Westminster Abbey. The atmosphere shifted from excitement to something deeper and more meaningful. The royals were greeted by the program director, Elena Rodriguez, who had spent months organizing this gathering. Elena had worked in youth services for over 2 decades and had seen firsthand the crisis affecting young people's mental health. She briefed William and Kate on the day's agenda, explaining that they would hear directly from young people about their challenges, their victories, and their hopes for better support systems. The first session began with a circle discussion. Kate sat cross-legged on the floor alongside the children, her formal attire seeming somehow appropriate yet not creating any barrier. William pulled up a chair, leaning forward attentively as the first young person began to speak. 15-year-old Amara from London shared how anxiety had nearly prevented her from attending school. Her voice shook at first, but as Kate nodded encouragingly and asked gentle questions, Amara's confidence grew. She described the turning point when she found a support group that understood her struggles. What struck everyone in the room was how intently both William and Kate listened. They didn't interrupt or rush anyone. When appropriate, they shared their own experiences with mental health advocacy and the stories they had heard from countless families. William mentioned his work with emergency responders and how trauma affects not just individuals, but entire communities. Kate spoke about early childhood development and how experiences in those formative years shape entire lives. Their knowledge wasn't superficial or rehearsed. It was clear they had invested genuine time and effort into understanding these issues deeply. Marcus finally gathered his courage to speak. His story was heavier than most. He described the darkness that followed his father's sudden death, the bullying he faced at school when his grades dropped, and the isolation he felt. The room fell completely silent as he spoke. When he finished, Kate reached over and gently touched his hand. She thanked him for his bravery in sharing something so personal. William added that Marcus's willingness to be vulnerable would help other young people feel less alone. In that moment, something powerful happened. Marcus realized his pain had purpose, and the tears that fell were different from the ones he had cried alone in his room. The morning session concluded with an art activity. Children and teenagers worked alongside William and Kate to create a collaborative mural representing hope and resilience. Paint-splattered hands worked together, mixing colors and sharing brushes. The princess had a smudge of blue paint on her cheek, which she seemed completely unbothered by. The prince's tie had been loosened, and he was fully engaged in helping a shy 7-year-old add handprints to the growing artwork. Laughter filled the sacred space, echoing off walls that had witnessed centuries of history. Today, Westminster Abbey was hosting something different but equally important: the healing and recognition of young lives that mattered deeply. As lunch was served in the Abbey's historic halls, the atmosphere remained remarkably relaxed and genuine. The organizers had arranged for the meal to be served family-style, with William and Kate sitting among the young people, rather than at a separate head table. This simple choice spoke volumes about the intention behind the entire event. The prince reached for serving dishes just like everyone else, passing plates and asking who wanted more vegetables with the ease of someone at a neighborhood gathering. Conversation flowed naturally around the tables. Kate found herself discussing fashion and social media pressures with a group of teenage girls from Liverpool. They opened up about the impossible standards they felt pushed to meet, the constant comparison that apps like Instagram created, and how it affected their self-worth daily. The princess listened without judgment, occasionally sharing observations from her own work with young people. She acknowledged that while her life looked privileged from the outside, the pressure of constant public scrutiny and criticism was something she had learned to navigate carefully. Her honesty surprised the girls, who had never considered that someone in her position might understand their feelings. At another table, William engaged with a group of boys discussing sports and competition. The conversation gradually shifted to performance anxiety and the fear of failure. 16-year-old David from Scotland admitted that his panic attacks before football matches had become so severe that he had considered quitting the sport he loved. William shared his own experiences with pressure, particularly during his military service and the constant weight of public expectations. He emphasized that seeking help wasn't weakness, but rather the strongest choice someone could make. David listened intently, later telling a counselor that those words changed something fundamental in how he viewed himself. After lunch, the group moved to a different section of the Abbey for what organizers called storytelling circles. This segment had been designed to allow deeper conversations in smaller groups. Each circle included about 8 young people, 1 or 2 counselors, and either William or Kate. The intimate setting encouraged vulnerability and connection. The royal couple had specifically requested this format, wanting to go beyond surface-level interactions and really understand what young people were experiencing. In Kate's circle, 17-year-old Jasmine from Cardiff spoke about being a young carer for her mother who suffered from chronic illness. Jasmine described the guilt she felt when wanting time for herself, the exhaustion of balancing school with caregiving responsibilities, and the loneliness of having friends who couldn't understand her reality. Her voice cracked as she admitted she sometimes resented her situation, then immediately apologized for saying such a terrible thing. Kate stopped her gently, explaining that having complicated feelings didn't make her a bad person or a bad daughter. It made her human. The relief on Jasmine's face was visible to everyone in the circle. Meanwhile, William's group included several young people who had experienced homelessness or unstable housing situations. 19-year-old Tyler spoke about aging out of the foster care system with nowhere to go and no support network. He described sleeping in train stations and feeling invisible to the thousands of people who walked past him daily. William listened with clear emotion showing on his face. He asked Tyler what had helped him turn things around, what resources had been missing, and what message he would want to share with policymakers. Tyler's answers were thoughtful and specific. He talked about the youth worker who refused to give up on him, the program that provided not just shelter but genuine mentorship, and the importance of treating homeless young people with dignity rather than suspicion. Between the storytelling circles, there was a brief break. Instead of retreating to a private room, William and Kate remained accessible. They stood in the Abbey's courtyard, continuing conversations that had begun inside. News photographers captured images of Kate laughing with a group of girls, their heads close together as they looked at something on a phone. William was photographed in deep conversation with Marcus, the boy who had spoken about losing his father. Their body language showed mutual respect and genuine engagement. These weren't posed photos. They were authentic moments happening naturally. Social media erupted as people began sharing clips and images from the event. Unlike typical royal coverage that focused on fashion choices or formal protocols, these posts highlighted the substance of what was happening. Hashtags related to youth mental health began trending. People shared their own stories, inspired by the vulnerability they had witnessed. Mental health organizations reported a spike in calls to their helplines. The ripple effect of the day's events was already beginning to spread far beyond Westminster Abbey's walls. As the afternoon session began, the format shifted again. This time, young people were invited to participate in workshops focused on practical coping strategies and peer support techniques. Mental health professionals led these sessions, but William and Kate participated fully, rather than observing from a distance. In a workshop on mindfulness and grounding techniques, Kate sat in a meditation circle, following the instructor's guidance along with everyone else. Her willingness to be a student rather than just a patron made a strong impression on the participants. William joined a workshop on peer support training, where young people learned how to recognize warning signs in friends and how to start difficult conversations about mental health. The facilitator used role-playing exercises, and the prince gamely participated, acting out scenarios alongside teenagers who initially felt self-conscious. His participation broke down barriers quickly. Soon everyone was engaged, practicing phrases and approaches that could literally save lives. William emphasized throughout that they weren't being trained to be therapists, but rather to be better friends and to know when professional help was needed. During a quiet moment between workshops, Elena Rodriguez pulled William aside to share some feedback she had been receiving from the young participants. Many had expressed that this felt different from other events they had attended. They felt genuinely heard rather than showcased. They appreciated that the royals asked follow-up questions that showed they were actually processing what was being said, rather than just waiting for their turn to speak. Several young people had told Elena they planned to continue the conversation started today, to reach out to friends they worried about, and to be more open about their own struggles. This was exactly the kind of lasting impact Elena had hoped for but hadn't been certain would materialize. Kate rejoined her workshop group just as they were discussing creative outlets for managing difficult emotions. A young artist named Sophie was showing her sketchbook, which contained powerful drawings depicting her journey through depression. The images were raw and honest, showing darkness gradually giving way to light. Kate studied each page carefully, asking Sophie about her artistic process and how creating this work had affected her healing. Sophie explained that putting her feelings on paper somehow made them less overwhelming. Kate mentioned that art therapy programs desperately needed more funding, and asked Sophie if she would be willing to share her work more publicly to help advocate for such programs. Sophie agreed, feeling seen and valued in a way she hadn't experienced before. The late afternoon light filtered through Westminster Abbey's magnificent stained glass windows, casting colorful patterns across the floor where the next session was about to begin. This segment focused on family connections and how mental health challenges affected entire households, not just individuals. Several parents and siblings had been invited to join, creating intergenerational conversations that rarely happened in such open, facilitated environments. Jennifer Thompson sat nervously beside her 14-year-old daughter, Emily, who had struggled with severe anxiety and depression for the past 2 years. Jennifer had watched helplessly as her bright social daughter withdrew into herself, refusing to leave her room for days at a time. The guilt Jennifer carried was crushing. She constantly questioned her parenting, wondering what she had done wrong or missed. When Kate approached their table and asked how they were doing, Jennifer's carefully maintained composure crumbled. Tears streamed down her face as she expressed feelings she had kept bottled up for months. The fear of losing her daughter, the exhaustion of constant worry, the isolation of feeling like she was the only parent going through this nightmare. Kate pulled a chair close and sat down, giving Jennifer her complete attention. She acknowledged that loving someone with mental health struggles was incredibly painful, and that parents often carried guilt that didn't belong to them. Emily watched this interaction with surprise. She had been so consumed by her own pain that she hadn't fully recognized how much her mother was suffering too. Kate facilitated a conversation between mother and daughter right there, helping them express things they had struggled to say at home. Emily told her mother that her depression wasn't caused by anything Jennifer had done, that sometimes brains just work differently. Jennifer told Emily how much she admired her courage, and that asking for help had been the bravest thing she could have done. By the end of their conversation, they were holding hands, something they hadn't done in months. Across the room, William engaged with Marcus and his mother, Patricia. She had raised Marcus alone after her husband's death, working 2 jobs to keep their small apartment while watching her son sink deeper into grief and isolation. Patricia described the breaking point when she found Marcus's journal filled with dark thoughts that terrified her. She had immediately sought help, but faced waiting lists, inadequate school resources, and a mental health system stretched impossibly thin. William listened to her frustration and validated her anger at a system that failed families during their most vulnerable moments. He took notes as she detailed specific gaps in services and promised that these stories would inform ongoing policy discussions. The facilitator leading this session introduced an activity where families could write letters to each other, expressing things that felt too difficult to say aloud. The room grew quiet except for the sound of pens moving across paper. Some wrote quickly, words pouring out. Others paused frequently, carefully choosing each phrase. William and Kate moved quietly through the space, available but not intrusive, offering tissues when needed and gentle encouragement when someone seemed stuck. A father named Robert wrote to his 16-year-old son, James, who had recently come out as gay and subsequently experienced severe bullying that led to a suicide attempt. Robert's letter apologized for not realizing sooner how much James was suffering, for not creating a home environment where his son felt safe being himself completely. He wrote that nothing mattered more than James's life and happiness, that he would spend however long it took learning to be the father James deserved. When they exchanged letters and read them, both were crying, but these were tears of connection and hope rather than despair. Kate noticed the exchange and approached them afterward. She asked James how he was doing and what support had been most helpful during his recovery. James explained that finding an LGBTQ+ youth group had been transformative. Being around others who understood his experience without explanation had eased the crushing loneliness. Kate asked if he would be comfortable sharing his story more widely to help other young people in similar situations. James looked at his father, who nodded encouragingly. James agreed, explaining that if his pain could prevent even one other person from reaching the breaking point he had, it would be worthwhile. As the letter-writing activity concluded, the group transitioned into sharing time. Those who felt comfortable were invited to read their letters or share insights from the exercise. The vulnerability in the room was palpable. A mother read her letter to her daughter who struggled with an eating disorder, expressing sorrow for the countless times she had commented on food or bodies without realizing the impact. A brother wrote to his younger sister about feeling helpless watching her battle depression, wishing he knew better how to support her. Each story was unique yet contained universal threads of love, fear, regret, and hope. William stood to address the room, speaking without notes or formal rhetoric. He thanked everyone for their courage in sharing such personal experiences. He acknowledged that the royal family itself was not immune to mental health struggles, referencing his own mother's battles with bulimia and his own journey processing grief and trauma. His openness surprised many in the room. Members of the royal family rarely disclosed such personal information. William explained that vulnerability wasn't weakness but rather the foundation of human connection. By hiding struggles, people reinforced shame and isolation. By sharing them, they created possibilities for healing and change. Kate added her perspective, focusing particularly on early intervention and the critical importance of creating environments where children felt safe expressing difficult emotions from a young age. She discussed her work around early childhood development and how patterns established in those first years often determined how people coped with challenges throughout their lives. She emphasized that parents couldn't protect children from all pain, but they could teach them that all emotions were valid and manageable. She spoke about the importance of modeling healthy coping mechanisms and seeking help when needed, noting that children watched and learned from adult behavior more than adult words. The conversation expanded to include practical discussions about resources and systemic changes needed. Parents shared information about programs that had helped them, warning others about ineffective approaches they had wasted time and money pursuing. Young people offered insights into what actually helped versus what adults thought should help. Healthcare professionals in attendance took notes, acknowledging that listening to lived experiences was essential for improving services. William and Kate participated actively in this discussion, asking questions that revealed their depth of understanding about healthcare systems, educational policies, and community resources. A grandmother named Margaret raised her hand hesitantly. She was raising her 2 granddaughters after their mother. Her daughter had died by suicide 3 years earlier. Margaret's voice shook as she described the guilt of feeling she had failed her own daughter, the determination to do better for her granddaughters, and the overwhelming challenge of parenting again at 68 while processing her own grief. Kate immediately went to her, kneeling beside her chair. She held Margaret's hand while the older woman spoke, occasionally offering tissue or water, mostly just present with compassion. Margaret's story reminded everyone that mental health challenges didn't discriminate by age, that grief and trauma affected multiple generations, and that no one should have to navigate these storms alone. As evening approached, the energy in Westminster Abbey shifted toward reflection and forward thinking. The organizers had planned a closing ceremony that would synthesize everything shared throughout the day and create momentum for ongoing action. However, before that formal conclusion, there was time for informal conversations and connections. Young people clustered in groups, exchanging contact information and promising to stay in touch. Parents who had felt isolated in their struggles discovered others facing similar challenges. The sense of community being built in real time was visible. William and Kate didn't rush this organic networking period. They moved through the space naturally, sometimes joining conversations, other times simply observing with evident satisfaction. A group of teenagers had gathered around Marcus, who was explaining the peer support group that had helped him process his father's death. Other young people who had experienced loss were asking questions, clearly hungry for resources and connection. Kate noticed this gathering and quietly asked Elena to ensure everyone in that circle received information about grief support services. Small interventions like this, often invisible to casual observers, demonstrated the royals' commitment to practical follow-through, rather than just symbolic presence. Sarah Mitchell, the mother who had traveled from Manchester, finally worked up courage to approach Kate. She had watched the princess throughout the day with growing admiration, not for her position or elegance, but for her evident genuine care. Sarah explained that her own teenage daughter struggled with social anxiety, and that attending this event had given her hope and practical strategies. Kate asked about her daughter's specific challenges and shared information about programs in the Manchester area that Sarah hadn't known existed. She also encouraged Sarah to maintain open communication with her daughter's school and not to accept inadequate support as inevitable. Before parting, Kate hugged Sarah, a gesture that felt like encouragement from one mother to another rather than a formal royal interaction. The closing ceremony began with dimmed lights and a video presentation. Images from throughout the day played across screens, capturing moments of tears and laughter, vulnerability and strength. The young people saw themselves represented with dignity and respect. There were no sensationalized portrayals of mental illness, no dramatic music suggesting tragedy. Instead, the presentation emphasized resilience, community, and hope. Several participants wiped away tears seeing themselves in these images, perhaps recognizing for the first time that their struggles didn't define them, but rather revealed their courage. Elena Rodriguez took the podium to formally close the event. She thanked William and Kate not with flowery language about royal graciousness, but with specific acknowledgement of their substantive engagement. She noted that they had arrived early to review materials and meet with organizers, that they had stayed beyond the scheduled time repeatedly throughout the day, and that they had demonstrated through countless small actions that this cause mattered deeply to them. She announced that the artwork created during the day would be professionally framed and donated to children's hospitals and mental health facilities across the United Kingdom, ensuring that the day's impact extended far beyond those present. William then addressed the assembled group. He spoke about feeling humbled by the stories he had heard, by the strength demonstrated by young people facing challenges he could hardly imagine. He acknowledged the systemic failures that had let many of them down and committed to continuing advocacy for better funding and improved services. He emphasized that real change required sustained effort, not just single events, and that the Royal Foundation would be expanding its mental health initiatives based directly on insights gathered today. Most importantly, he told the young people that their voices mattered, that their experiences were valid, and that speaking up was changing how society understood and addressed mental health. Kate's remarks focused on hope and possibility. She acknowledged that many in the room had faced dark moments when continuing felt impossible. She honored those who had lost that battle, noting that each life lost to mental health struggles represented a failure of collective responsibility. But she also celebrated everyone present who had chosen to keep fighting, to seek help, to show up despite fear and pain. She emphasized that healing wasn't linear, that having bad days after good ones didn't mean someone was failing or moving backward. Recovery was a journey with ups and downs, and the goal was progress, not perfection. She announced a new initiative that would establish peer support networks in schools across the United Kingdom, modeled on successful programs represented at today's gathering. Trained students would be available to support classmates, recognizing warning signs and connecting peers with professional resources when needed. The program would include ongoing supervision and support for the peer counselors themselves, acknowledging that helpers also needed care. Several young people in the audience had been involved in developing this proposal, and Kate publicly thanked them for their contributions and leadership. The ceremony included a candle lighting moment where each person present lit a small candle from a central flame. The symbolism was clear but powerful, individual lights combining to brighten the darkness. As candles were lit, people were invited to speak names of those they were remembering or honoring. Some named friends or family members lost to suicide. Others named their younger selves who had survived trauma. Some named therapists or teachers who had believed in them. The Abbey filled with quiet voices, each speaking truth into a space that honored every name, every story, every life. Tyler, the young man who had experienced homelessness, lit his candle and spoke his own name. It was a profound moment of self-recognition and self-honoring that brought many to tears. William, standing nearby, placed a hand on Tyler's shoulder in acknowledgement. Later, Tyler would describe that simple gesture as transformative, a moment when someone who could have been anywhere chose to stand beside him and witness his worth. After the candle lighting, there was a musical performance by a young singer-songwriter named Lily, whose songs addressed mental health themes with honesty and artistry. She had written the featured song after her own psychiatric hospitalization, and the lyrics captured both despair and hope. As she sang, many in the audience closed their eyes, some swaying gently, clearly connecting deeply with the words. Kate watched with visible emotion, occasionally wiping her eyes. William stood with crossed arms, head bowed, fully absorbed in the performance. When Lily finished, the applause was sustained and heartfelt. She had given voice to experiences many had felt but struggled to express. The formal program concluded with Elena presenting William and Kate with a bound book containing letters from all the young participants. Each had written about what the day had meant to them and their hopes for the future. This wasn't a ceremonial gift to be politely accepted and forgotten. Both royals sat down immediately and began reading entries aloud to each other, laughing at funny anecdotes and growing serious at profound reflections. They promised to read every single letter and to respond personally to those who had included addresses. Given their track record of following through on such commitments, participants believed them. As the official ceremony ended, nobody seemed eager to leave. Westminster Abbey's staff had anticipated this, arranging for tea and refreshments in an adjacent space. The atmosphere became celebratory yet intimate, with people continuing conversations started earlier or forming new connections. William and Kate didn't retreat to a private area but instead joined the reception, accepting cups of tea and continuing to engage authentically with participants. Marcus found himself in conversation with Tyler, the young man who had experienced homelessness. Despite their different circumstances, they discovered common ground in understanding profound loss and the difficult journey of rebuilding life afterward. They exchanged contact information, both expressing genuine interest in staying connected. This organic peer support facilitated by creating space for authentic interaction, was exactly what organizers had hoped to inspire. The royal presence had brought people together, but the relationships forming would continue long after William and Kate left. Jennifer and Emily Thompson stood together watching the scene, Jennifer's arm around her daughter's shoulders. Emily leaned into her mother in a way she hadn't in many months. The day had opened something between them, creating space for vulnerability and connection. They had heard other families speak truths that mirrored their own experiences, making them feel less alone and less broken. Emily whispered to her mother that she wanted to try family therapy, something she had resisted before. Jennifer squeezed her daughter's shoulder, silently communicating relief and gratitude. Kate noticed their embrace and caught Jennifer's eye across the room. They exchanged a knowing look, woman to woman, mother to mother, recognizing shared understanding about loving someone through mental health struggles. No words were needed. Jennifer later told friends that this single moment of being truly seen by another mother who understood made the entire journey to London worthwhile. It reminded her that she wasn't alone in this challenge, that countless other parents were navigating similar storms, and that connection and community were possible even in isolation. William ended up in an extended conversation with Robert and James, the father and son who had shared their experience with James coming out, and the subsequent bullying and suicide attempt. Robert asked the prince directly how to be a better advocate for LGBTQ+ youth mental health. William listened to his concerns about not knowing enough, feeling inadequate to support James fully. The prince shared resources but also encouraged Robert to see that his willingness to learn and his unconditional love were the most important gifts he could offer. James listened to this exchange with growing emotion, later telling counselors that hearing his father ask those questions publicly felt like a powerful statement of love. As people began slowly departing, organizers coordinated transportation and ensured everyone had contact information for follow-up support. The event hadn't been designed as a one-time occurrence, but rather as the beginning of ongoing relationship and advocacy. Participants were being connected with regional support networks, invited to join online communities, and offered opportunities to become involved in mental health advocacy themselves. Several young people had already expressed interest in speaking publicly about their experiences, transformed from isolated individuals into potential agents of change. The media gathered outside had multiplied throughout the day as word spread about the significance of what was happening inside. Unlike typical royal coverage focused on fashion and protocol, journalists were preparing stories about substance and impact. They had been briefed by participants willing to share their experiences, and many reporters seemed genuinely moved by what they heard. The narrative being crafted wasn't about royal charity or noblesse oblige, but rather about authentic connection and systemic advocacy for change. Sarah Mitchell emerged with her daughters, immediately surrounded by reporters asking about the event. She spoke articulately about the hope and resources she was taking home, about feeling empowered rather than helpless in supporting her daughter's mental health. Her genuine enthusiasm and specific examples provided powerful testimony that resonated far beyond typical royal event coverage. News segments that evening would feature her story prominently, helping millions of other parents feel less alone in their struggles. As William and Kate finally prepared to depart, they made one final circuit through the remaining participants. They weren't rushing through obligatory farewells, but rather taking time for genuine goodbyes. Kate hugged Margaret, the grandmother raising her daughter's children, holding her for a long moment. She whispered something that made Margaret nod and smile through tears. Later, Margaret would reveal that Kate had said, "Your daughter would be so proud of you and so grateful." Those words provided comfort Margaret desperately needed, but hadn't received from anyone else. William shook hands with Marcus, pulling him into a brief hug afterward. He told Marcus that his courage in sharing his story would help other young people feel less alone, that his father would be proud of the young man he was becoming. Marcus later described this moment as when something shifted inside him, when he began to believe that his pain could have purpose, that survival itself was a form of heroism worth honoring. The prince's words came from someone whose own mother had died tragically, someone who understood grief's long shadow. That shared understanding made the encouragement meaningful rather than platitudinous. The royal couple's car finally pulled away from Westminster Abbey as evening settled over London. But inside, the impact of the day continued rippling outward. Participants lingered, reluctant to return to regular life after such an extraordinary experience. They sat in small groups processing what they had witnessed and participated in. Many expressed surprise at how different the event had been from their expectations. They had anticipated formal speeches and photo opportunities. Instead, they had experienced genuine conversation, authentic vulnerability, and the beginning of real relationships. Elena Rodriguez remained until the last participant departed, ensuring everyone had safe transportation and necessary support information. She felt simultaneously exhausted and energized. The event had exceeded her hopes in every meaningful way. The feedback she was receiving indicated that lives had been genuinely touched, that perspectives had shifted, that hope had been kindled where despair had taken root. She knew that measuring the full impact would take months or years, but the immediate evidence was powerful. Late that night, social media continued exploding with posts from the event. Unlike typical viral royal content focused on superficial elements, these posts emphasized substance. People shared specific moments that had moved them, quotes from young participants, and commitments to better support mental health in their own communities. The hashtags associated with the event trended globally, introducing millions of people to conversations about youth mental health, breaking down stigma through personal stories, and creating virtual communities of support that complemented the physical connections formed at Westminster Abbey. News coverage that evening and the following morning was remarkably consistent across outlets. Conservative and progressive publications alike praised the event's authenticity and substance. Royal correspondents who had covered hundreds of engagements described this one as different, more meaningful, evidence of genuine rather than performative commitment. Mental health professionals interviewed for stories emphasized the importance of high-profile advocacy in normalizing conversations about psychological well-being and reducing shame around seeking help. In the weeks and months following the Westminster Abbey gathering, the true measure of its impact became apparent through countless ripple effects spreading across the United Kingdom and beyond. Mental health organizations reported sustained increases in people seeking help, specifically mentioning the event as motivation to stop suffering in silence. Schools contacted the Royal Foundation requesting information about establishing peer support programs, like those discussed at the gathering. Parents reached out seeking resources for supporting children through mental health challenges, no longer willing to accept inadequate systems as unchangeable reality. Marcus returned to Birmingham transformed by his experience. His school counselor noticed immediate differences in his demeanor and engagement. He volunteered to speak at a school assembly about mental health, something he would never have considered before. Standing before his peers, many of whom had witnessed his struggles without understanding them, Marcus shared his story with the same vulnerability he had shown at Westminster Abbey. The response stunned him. Students he barely knew approached afterward to thank him, several admitting their own struggles with grief, anxiety, and depression. His courage created permission for others to stop hiding. Marcus also received a personal letter from William, not a form response but a genuine note referencing specific parts of their conversation and encouraging his continued advocacy. The prince included information about youth leadership opportunities in mental health organizations, suggesting Marcus had valuable perspective to contribute. This direct follow-through, turning a single interaction into ongoing connection, demonstrated the authenticity behind the royal couple's engagement. Marcus framed the letter and looked at it whenever doubt crept in about whether his voice mattered. Emily Thompson's relationship with her mother continued, improving as they implemented strategies learned at the gathering. They established regular check-in conversations where both could express difficult emotions without judgment. Emily began attending group therapy with other teenagers, finding tremendous relief in community that understood her experiences. Jennifer joined a parent support group, discovering that sharing struggles with others facing similar challenges reduced her crushing sense of isolation and failure. Both credited the Westminster Abbey event with creating momentum toward healing that had felt impossible before. Tyler's trajectory proved equally transformative. The confidence gained from sharing his story publicly led him to accept a position as peer mentor in the program that had helped him transition off the streets. He worked with newly homeless youth, using his lived experience to build trust and provide practical guidance. He also began speaking at schools and community centers about the realities of youth homelessness, challenging stereotypes and advocating for better support systems. William had connected him with housing advocacy organizations, and Tyler found himself testifying before local government committees about gaps in services. His voice, once silenced by invisibility and shame, now carried weight and created change. James and his father Robert became advocates for LGBTQ+ youth mental health in their community. They partnered with local organizations to establish safe spaces and support groups. Robert attended training to become a facilitator for parents of LGBTQ+ children, helping other fathers navigate the journey he had struggled through alone. James joined a youth advisory board for a national mental health charity, bringing perspective that adults often missed. When James spoke at events, he always mentioned the conversation at Westminster Abbey as the turning point when he began seeing his survival not as weakness but as strength worth celebrating. The collaborative mural created during the event traveled to hospitals, schools, and community centers across the country as promised. Each location where it was displayed saw increased conversations about mental health and requests for resources. The artwork became more than decoration. It became a catalyst for dialogue, a visual reminder that struggles were shared and that speaking up was possible. Young people stood before it, seeing their own experiences reflected in the colors and handprints, feeling less alone in their battles. Margaret, the grandmother raising her granddaughters after losing her daughter, connected with other grandparents in similar situations through networks established after the event. They formed a support group that met monthly, sharing practical advice and emotional support. Margaret began writing a blog about her experiences, processing grief while raising children in her later years. Her honest reflections resonated with thousands of readers, many of whom reached out to share their own stories. The isolation that had nearly crushed her transformed into connection that sustained her through difficult days. Kate personally followed up with several participants through letters and occasional phone calls. She checked on Jasmine, the young carer from Cardiff, connecting her with respite care resources and scholarship opportunities that recognized the challenges she faced. She stayed in touch with Sophie, the artist, and facilitated opportunities for her work to be featured in exhibitions focused on mental health awareness. These weren't publicity stunts, but private acts of follow-through that participants deeply appreciated. The message was clear. They mattered beyond a single event. Their well-being was genuinely important, and support would continue. The peer support program in schools that Kate had announced launched 6 months after the Westminster Abbey gathering. Pilot programs in 50 schools across diverse communities showed remarkable results. Students trained as peer supporters reported increased confidence and leadership skills. Those who utilized peer support services described feeling more comfortable seeking help from trained peers than from adult counselors initially. The program included robust mental health education, destigmatization efforts, and clear protocols for connecting students with professional help when needed. Early data suggested significant increases in help-seeking behavior and decreases in crisis interventions, indicating earlier identification of struggles. William continued advocating for increased mental health funding in meetings with government officials and healthcare leaders. He referenced stories from Westminster Abbey frequently, putting human faces and real consequences on policy decisions. His advocacy wasn't merely symbolic. He worked behind the scenes to connect organizations, facilitate partnerships, and push for concrete changes in how services were delivered. Mental health providers noticed a shift in how their work was perceived and funded, attributing some of this progress to sustained high-profile advocacy that kept issues in public consciousness. A documentary film crew had been granted access to portions of the Westminster Abbey event, and the resulting program aired on national television 8 months later. The filmmakers focused on following several participants before, during, and after the gathering, showing how a single day had created momentum for lasting change. Viewing numbers exceeded expectations, and the documentary sparked renewed conversations about mental health across the country. Schools requested copies to use in health education classes. Community organizations hosted viewing parties followed by discussions. The film became an unexpected cultural touchstone, evidence that authentic storytelling about mental health resonated deeply with audiences hungry for genuine connection. Sarah Mitchell and her daughters appeared in the documentary, sharing their journey with remarkable honesty. Sarah's daughter spoke on camera about her anxiety and how her mother's participation in the Westminster Abbey event had changed their family dynamics for the better. Their segment generated thousands of messages from other families facing similar challenges. Sarah started a blog connecting parents navigating youth mental health issues, creating virtual community that extended the work begun at the gathering. She emphasized that she wasn't an expert, but rather a fellow traveler willing to share what she was learning. The anniversary of the Westminster Abbey event was marked with gatherings across the United Kingdom. Participants reunited to reflect on the year's journey and celebrate progress while acknowledging ongoing challenges. William and Kate attended the main anniversary gathering, again at Westminster Abbey. The atmosphere was joyful and triumphant, filled with stories of healing and growth. But there was also space for grief and continued struggle. Acknowledgement that mental health recovery wasn't a straight line and that support needed to be sustained, rather than episodic. During the anniversary event, several young people who had been too unwell to attend the original gathering shared how hearing about it had given them hope during dark times. One young woman described listening to news coverage while in a psychiatric hospital, feeling for the first time that maybe she wasn't irreparably broken, that recovery might be possible. She credited that seed of hope with motivating her continued treatment. Now, a year later, she stood before the group sharing her progress and thanking those whose courage in speaking up had reached her when she needed it most. There wasn't a dry eye in the room. William addressed the anniversary gathering by acknowledging both progress and remaining work. He shared statistics about increased help-seeking, expanded services, and reduced stigma. But he also noted that too many young people still fell through gaps in systems, that funding remained